The man to my left, Salman Rushdie, was born in Mumbai, India, educated there and in England. He majored in history at Cambridge University, and after a very brief career as an ad writer, he came to be a writer full-time. He's the author of 11 books, most of them focused on life on the Asian subcontinent. The themes of migration and tension between cultures during times of change feature prominently in them. He was awarded the prestigious Booker Prize for his second book, Midnight's Children. The Satanic Verses, the book that made him not only famous but notorious, was published in 1988. On Valentine's Day in 1989, the Ayatollah Khomeini, then the supreme ruler of Iran, issued a fatwa in order for Rushdie's death for what he declared were offenses against Islam. It sent him into hiding for 9 years. We won't go into all the literary honors he's awarded. It would take far too much time. Suffice it to say he's been covered in glory both here and abroad, including a knighthood for his service to literature by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And through 11 books, a whole lot of turmoil, 2 splendid sons in 9 years in a surrealistic world that would have broken probably most of the rest of us, he's remained true to one ethos, that a free society means having the freedom to speak aloud one's beliefs and opinions, no matter how strenuously the rest of the world disagrees with them, perhaps especially then. His latest book, Joseph Anton, tells us why, and he's going to talk to us about it now. So it's my honor and privilege to present to you Sir Salman Rushdie.
I think we should dispense with the sir.
Yes, sir.
I was telling you just before we came out that I have this friend in New York who has a very precocious 8-year-old daughter who got very excited when she heard about the knighthood, and then she ran into me on Union Square and her face fell because I looked the same.
Where was your armor? Where was your horse?
She said, "So, Salman, how's the whole knight thing going?" You're like, where's Excalibur, dude? Anyway, all you get is, you get tables at restaurants.
This is a book about what I tend to think of as your 9 lost years, which weren't really lost, but they were lost in terms of your public visibility a lot. Mm-hmm. You have said in several interviews that you thought perhaps with this fatwa having been issued, that you were the first harbinger of a lot of anti-American feeling, anti-Western feeling in the Muslim world, and that things started to pile on after that, that people maybe didn't know what they were looking at when they saw it because it was just you and you were alone, and they thought, oh, this poor sap, wow, he's got this guy, issued a death warrant on him, and glad I'm not him. You use the analogy of the movie The Birds, that 58, 61, I know there's movie people out here, Hitchcock movie that starred Tippi Hedren that was set in Bodega Bay in Northern California, and it was about your common lawn crow run amok because there were so many of them, and in the beginning it started out very innocently. Mm-hmm. Talk about that analogy a little bit.
Well, it's just one bird sitting on a climbing frame in a school playground. You don't have to draw any conclusion from it. It's just one bird, It's only afterwards, when the sky is full of birds, that you think, oh yeah, there was that first bird, And I think it was sort of my misfortune to be, I don't know if it was the very first, but it was like right near the beginning of this moment of it's not just anti-Americanism, because I think the rise of radical Islam has been very dangerous for people inside Islamic countries. And one of the things I was trying to draw attention to in those years was the way in which the attack on the Satanic Verses was mirrored by attacks on writers and intellectuals not just in Iran, across the Muslim world, against whom exactly the same language was being used, heresy, apostasy, in this medieval vocabulary, and during that time there were writers being killed. There was in Turkey, Algeria, Egypt, Iran, there were people who were actually getting killed for the same thing. And I would try and say that to people, in the West, say, look, all you have to do is just look over there. It's going on it's not just this, you know, it's not just me. And for a long time, people thought that like I was making excuses, you know, that was in some way special pleading, you know, and I was trying to mitigate my terrible crime by saying that there are other people in trouble too. And I think it was really only, it was only after the 9/11 attacks that attitude changed for a lot of people. And I remember, I was living in New York at the time, and I remember in those sort of awful weeks after September 11, when a number of journalist friends of mine, quite heavyweight journalist friends of mine, said, "Oh, now we understand what happened to you," you know.
Now that it's happened to us, it makes sense what's happened to you.
I remember thinking, you know, really, that had to happen.
Yeah.
You know,
in order for you to be alarmed.
But that's sort of what did have to happen. That's, at that moment, I think, what people previously saw as a sort of weird, incomprehensible story, just about me, became everybody's story.
Sure.
And that's why I tried to suggest in the book that you can draw more or less a straight line between the two things. And this thing was growing. We didn't notice it growing, and then it burst upon everybody.
You had a part in your book that I thought was very funny in the beginning, where everybody was saying, you know, fatwa, the Ayatollah has issued a fatwa, and we automatically translated that, you know, made the jump into death sentence for blah, 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 and you were sort of fuming. You said, that's not even what a fatwa is. And that's a very writerly response.
Pedantic moments, you know, when everybody was using this word to mean the death edict. And
okay, so talk about what a fatwa really is and when it's really issued.
Well, the verb, it just comes from the verb to say. So fatwa is being issued in the Muslim world every day by every mullah you can find. You could go and ask any mullah for a fatwa about anything. And they do. And I mean, mostly they're not death fatwas. I mean, that's very unusual. But the word doesn't have anything to do with death. And yet it came to mean that because of this one. I mean, there are jokes in Iran about the insane fatwas that get issued by the mullahs. I mean, I remember there was, and this is I'm not making this up, all right? There was the mullahs in Qom, which is the theological center in Iran, were asked about the limits of incest. You know, like
limits of incest.
Yeah, what is incest and what isn't? You know, first cousins, is that incest, etc. Anyway, there were all these judgments. So the question arose of the aunt by marriage. Was that, if you were to happen to have sex with your aunt by marriage, is that incest?
And they had an answer for this.
Yes, their answer was yes, it was incest, but there was an exception to the rule. And the exception was if you, the man, were unable to control the entrance into your bed of the aunt by marriage, then you couldn't be responsible for the consequences. And the example that was given was that, for example, if the aunt by marriage was sleeping in the bedroom directly above you and the floor gave way, so that the aunt by marriage fell downwards into your bed, well, after that, it's not your fault.
Just chalk it up to a gift from heaven and keep moving. Okay.
So, some fatwas are like that.
The Ayatollah allegedly issues this. You say he's very, very ill, probably dying.
He was on his deathbed.
So it very well could have been someone who wanted this to happen, who issued it in the name of the Ayatollah.
Yeah, we don't know.
But nonetheless, it goes out. It goes out to all corners of Iran, to many corners of the Muslim world, that this person, this Rushdie, is going to have to be eliminated so that the insult to Islam will also be eliminated for good and for all. It was only extended to you, right? Not to your family.
No. It wasn't. It was to anyone who had knowingly worked on the publication of the book, which meant the publishers and translators and so on. And there were very serious attacks on both publishers and translators. I mean, my Japanese translator was actually killed.
Yeah.
And not by some random nut. It's quite clear when it was investigated that it was a professional hit. So somebody was sent to do it, and he was a university professor. He was killed at his college campus in an elevator. My Italian translator was almost killed, was sort of beaten and stabbed, and managed to live. The book's Norwegian publisher, my very close friend William Nygaard, was shot in the back 3 times. and miraculously not only survived but made a full recovery. I mean, wasn't even crippled or anything, you know. So, but yeah, I mean, you know, there were bombs in bookstores. You know, Cody's bookstore in Berkeley was firebombed, and everywhere elsewhere in the world. So it wasn't just me, no. And in many ways, I was the best protected person threatened.
Yeah.
Booksellers weren't protected like that. Publishers, translators, they weren't protected, and they were all in danger too.
This sort of reminds me of when there were anthrax scares, and remember the congressional mailrooms and newsrooms, and they'd get these letters saying, we've sent anthrax, your people are going to die, whatever. And people were very afraid because they didn't know what was coming in the mail.
Yeah.
They didn't know about strange things being left as packages with the security people in the front, and the fear begat fear. And part of what you're talking about, I think, is the reaction in
Yeah.
publishing is, oh my God, you know, we published this, now what happens?
Yeah, for publishers, it was a very frightening time, no question. And I think that's left its mark on the publishing industry. I mean, there's a point near the end of this book where I tried to understand whether one should describe this whole battle as a success or a failure. You know, I mean, did we win or lose in this fight? And it seems to me that if you look at the narrow story, you know, which is the attack on the book and its author and publishers, I mean, we didn't do so badly. You know, I mean, the book was defended, and it's still available in, you know, whatever it is, 50 languages or something, and you know, the author's still here too. You know? And by the way, the Ayatollah Khomeini, he's dead. But if you look at the kind of wider issue, that I think there's no question that there was a chilling effect, that people were scared. You know, and I think now it's harder to do anything which seems even, not even critical of Islam, but even about Islam. People are much more unwilling to publish that. You know, and I don't say that nobody would do it. I mean, I think there are still people with, you know, with a bit of backbone, I think. But there's no question it's become harder because of the fear factor, because people remember how frightening it was. And, you know, nobody wants to go there again.
Booksellers said, you know, if we can get the book, we're going to sell it.
No,
and
I
we'll
mean,
take
lots,
our chances.
Lots.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, it's a great, one of the great parts of this story is the courage of the book trade. You know, I mean, I would get letters all the time from booksellers all over America and elsewhere, you know, who would tell me anecdotes, not necessarily as dramatic as bombs, you know, but they would say that on a very regular basis, people would come into the store and threaten the staff. You know, to say, if you don't take that book off the shelf, you know, I mean, really very alarming, like, we know where your children go to school kind of sentences, you know, were being said. In spite of this, nobody caved in. I would get these letters from booksellers telling me about these episodes and saying, you know what we did? We put the book in the window. You know, we put more copies up the front of the store. And that really was a reaction of the book trade internationally. You know, and I think it's not been said enough. There's been so much that was written about this, and, you know, a lot of it was about me. But what was not really said was that that was the front line. You know, I wasn't the front line. That was the front line. And they really did an extraordinary job. And without that, you know, there had been no free speech to defend. You know, if people had got too scared to sell the book, then you can defend the principle, but what's the principle when you haven't got the book anymore? You know,
Sure.
so we owe, I mean, a lot to those people.
Very soon after this was issued, you got a visit from security folks in London who said, we don't think you ought to go home tonight. We think maybe you ought to find someplace else to stay, and we got to figure this out. And that kind of began your 9 lost years.
Nobody thought it was going to take a very long time to sort out, because it was so outrageous, you know, that the head of state of a country far away should point a finger across the world and say, you know, kill that person, and by the way, if you don't, I'm going to send some death squads to do it.
On somebody else's sovereign territory.
On somebody else's sovereign territory, a citizen of that country, living in his own country, who's done nothing wrong in that country. You know, how could this be allowed to happen in the late years of the 20th century? And there was an assumption that, you know, the old man had shut his mouth off, and then there would be diplomats would do what they did, and politicians would do what they did, and there'd be some solution found by which it would be retracted. And everybody thought that. The intelligence services thought that, the police thought that. I tried very hard to think that. It took about a week or little more, 8 or 9 days, during which there was intense diplomacy, to try and get this thing dealt with. And it was after that it became quite clear that it hadn't worked, and that the Iranians were not going to back down. At that point, the police said to me, well, we don't know how long this thing is going on. I don't think they were particularly pleased. I don't think that they had bought into a kind of long-term project either. Everybody thought we're just giving him protection for a few days while this gets fixed. And then it took a decade, which nobody at all had thought. So, yeah, it was, I wouldn't recommend it. If you could possibly avoid it, avoid it.
Talk a little bit about your security detail and how you came to choose your name.
Scotland Yard has a secret police, it's called the Special Branch, and the Special Branch has a thing called A Squad, which does the personal protection, and is the sort of elite bit of the British Metropolitan Police. And they're highly trained, they're unbelievably trained in accuracy with weapons. They told me an interesting thing. They said in the United States, they said, people often are carrying their weapons here, right, inside the jacket. And they said the trouble with that is, when you draw the weapon, you're having to go like this. So you're going through that arc. And if you happen to pull the trigger too soon, if you're aiming over here, it can kill somebody over there or over there. So it's dangerous, right? So they would wear their weapons here, which would mean that you would pull in a straight line out, like that, you see, and they would say that's much more accurate, but it has a disadvantage, which is if you fire too soon, you shoot yourself in the ass.
I was just thinking that.
So, life with a gun. We got to know each other pretty well. And there was, the name is because they decided when I was living at these various, Dick Cheney-like undisclosed locations. Dick wasn't there at the time, I'm happy to say.
He was with you in thought, though.
That would be such an ugly idea that I don't even want to consider that. But they wanted to train themselves to not use my name by accident if they were sort of walking around the neighborhood. Okay. And if somebody said, oh, Salman asked us to pick up some toothpaste, and it would sort of blow the cover. So they wanted a name that they could all practice to use instead of my name. And so they said, pick one, And they said, don't pick an Indian name because it's too obvious. People might work it out, etc. So in the end, I fooled around with the names of writers, and I ended up with the first names of Conrad and Chekhov, which is what Joseph Anton is. And in part it was because I felt both those writers had something to say about the situation I was in. Chekhov, because Chekhov is one of the great poets of melancholy and loneliness and people being in one place and yearning to be somewhere else. And, so I felt a little Chekhovian. At that time. And Conrad, because I remember that one of my close friends was the late, great Palestinian intellectual Edward Said. And I remember that Edward was a great Conrad scholar. And he had his own battle because he had to fight against CLL, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, for more than 7 years. It was a long battle. And he told me that he had always been inspired by this line in Conrad's now improperly titled The Nigger of the Narcissus, in which this sailor who's dying of TB aboard a ship is eventually asked by his shipmates. They say, why do you come on the boat? If you knew, you must have known you were sick. If you knew you were sick, why do you get on the boat? Why didn't you stay home? And he has this beautiful answer. He says, I must live till I die, mustn't I? And Edward certainly practiced that. You know, he went on teaching and lecturing and traveling and writing and so on. And he, you know, he wanted to go on being Edward, you know, to live until you die, you know. And I thought, well, my turn now, you know. And I really was also sort of took that line sort of as a motto, almost. Anyway, so Joseph Anton, it seemed to have something to do with the situation I was in.
They never called you
No,
Joseph.
they just called me Joe. And I wanted to, you know...
They wanted something easy to pronounce.
You know, I wanted to throw something at them. I hated it. I just hated it. And I mean, one of the reasons I made it the title of the book was just to encourage people to think how strange it would be to be asked to give up your name. Also, the ethnicity of your name. And to be then called by that other name in its diminutive form. You know, you know, I think what would have happened if you'd called Joseph Conrad Joe?
You've been punched. You'd have been punched.
I don't think you would have had a very happy Joseph Conrad. Anyway, so yeah, it was awful. And I just thought putting it as the title of the book was a way of suggesting to people how awful it would be. Except that there's another thing too, which is that I'd always wanted to write a book which had a person's name as a title. Mm. You know, David Copperfield. You know, Huckleberry Finn. Mm-hmm. You know, Robinson Crusoe. You know, Tom Sawyer, Tom Jones. You know, Daniel Deronda, Silas Marner. You know, these are books, I thought. You know, you know, this is a book that knows what it is. It's just named after the person. It tells you their story, etc. And so I thought I want to do that. And so there was that too.
How long did it take you to get used to being Joe, to the people who were responsible for your safety?
Yeah, I never got used to it. So much else to get pissed off about. But for some reason, this really kind of, it never stopped rankling.
So you give up your identity.
Yeah.
In many ways, you give up your ethnicity. You give up your independence.
Yeah.
Walk us through what a normal day would look like for you. You know, you get up, do you make your own coffee?
It wasn't a normal day for a long time because there wasn't a settled place to have a normal day in. I mean, one of the strange things was that I think people at that time felt that there was this sort of thing that was much said in the press, that I was being held somewhere in government safe houses. You know, and government safe house is a phrase we've learned from spy novels. Mm-hmm. You know, and if there actually are such things as government safe houses, I've never seen one. Mm-hmm. You know? Because they put me in a very difficult situation of saying, first of all, that they didn't wish me to go back to, I mean, I had a house.
But you couldn't go back to it.
They said they wouldn't want me to go there because they said it would endanger the neighbors, and the cost, essentially the cost of protecting the street would be prohibitive. You know, so I couldn't do that. And then they said it's up to you to find the places you have to go. And this was difficult because I was supposed to be invisible. You know, I mean, invisible man rents house. It's not easy to do. This was, remember, there is no internet. There's none of that.
Right.
You can't go online and, you know, find a property and rent it. None of that. You have to go physically, or somebody has to go. So it was very stressful that let's say the first 2 years, roughly speaking, when there wasn't anywhere that I was for that long. You know, I mean, sometimes I managed to borrow places from friends, and sometimes people had to go on my behalf and rent places, and that, you know, sometimes for a month or two, sometimes for a bit longer, but sometimes for a bit shorter, and it was so disruptive that there sort of really wasn't a normal. You know? And then after that, gradually, I got them to agree that I could be in places in a more permanent way, and then it got easier.
And always your security detail went with you, right?
Yeah. Usually,
so they had to have a place to stay as well.
Usually 4 people, usually two protection officers and 2 drivers. And you had to learn all this police black humor. You know, there's a lot of terrible police jokes. Terrible.
That's why reporters love them.
Yeah. Well, the drivers. The protection officers would refer to the drivers as OFDs. And I would say, I say, what's that stand for? And they said, it stands for only fucking drivers.
Their sardonic description of themselves.
Yes, and that's police comedy. I was taken once to, I mean, what a really example of real black comedy. In the middle of Scotland Yard, there is this place called the Black Museum, which is not open to the public. It's a place in which there's weapons and all kinds of things. Everything there has actually been used to commit a murder. And there's everything you can think of. There's, umbrellas that are guns. There's, fountain pens that are guns. Everything you see from James Bond movies, they're all there. And they've all actually been used.
Wow.
People have actually been killed with those things. They have the bath in which the mass murderer Christie would boil his victims down in acid. Things like that. But the weirdest thing they had is they had a big glass jar inside which there were a pair of human arms severed here, like this, right? And I said, what is that?
Yeah.
And I said, are those really human arms? They said, yeah, it's actually somebody's arms. And there had been this murderer in England who had escaped the country and was eventually shot while committing another crime in Germany. And so the Germans had informed the British that they'd killed him. And the British said, okay, thanks a lot. Could you just fingerprint him and send us the fingerprints so we can close the file? And the Germans, this is German humor. Just set back the arm, saying, you
do it yourself.
You fingerprint him. So this is this sort of world of insane black comedy that I was living in. Except it wasn't funny a lot of the time.
You had another moment. This guy wasn't even a cop. He was a fellow writer. When you went to a memorial service for one of your friends, he was sitting behind you, I guess, and he said, well, Salman, I think we'll probably be back here next week for you. And I thought, oh, that's really horrible.
Yes, Paul Theroux. To be fair to Paul, I think he was trying to make light of the situation. I mean, it's a joke that didn't completely come off.
In the middle of someone else's memorial service,
And he has been he's been very apologetic about it. I mean, I think he knows that he goofed,
Just a little.
But he did.
This must have been a tremendous strain, not just for you, but for your friends, for your wife, for your child at that point, because at that point you only had one. How did people cope with this? I mean, your friends, it's like, well, we'd like to put you up, so you come, but we got to find a place for 4 other guys as well. And oh, by the way, somebody could kill me when I go out to pick up the paper in the morning.
One of the things that I think is a big theme, it has to do with friendship. One of the things I would get asked, for instance, by journalists in those days, were people afraid to be associated with me? Were people sort of backing off, in order to avoid some kind of danger by association? And the truth is, what happened was the opposite of that. What happened was that people stepped closer to me. And it was quite remarkable. I mean, it's one of the things it's wonderful to be able to write about it, because, for 23 years, we've all kept our mouths shut about what went on, and all these people who did just exceptional things, like moving out of their own homes and saying, you live here, and helping me in every way, practically, emotionally, sometimes even politically. I mean, like, for example, Christopher Hitchens was one of the people who was very active at the political level. It really was the opposite. People closed, and one of my closest friends, American writer Bill Buford, who was then editing Granta magazine in London, and afterwards was literary editor of the New Yorker magazine. So, but anyway, Bill was living in London then, and he said to me, your friends are going to form an iron ring around you and you will be able to live inside it. And that's really what happened. And remember, this is the literary world. It's the leakiest, most gossipy, most unreliable, bitchy, backstabbing, bunch of people you could conceivably get in one place at one time. And yet, for 10 years, everybody kept every secret. Nobody leaked anything. And many of these people, they knew where I was living. They would actually even be allowed eventually to come and visit me there, and sort of just to, make life a bit easier. Not one person ever leaked anything. And it was an extraordinary thing, especially considering who they were.
Do you think part of it was there, except for some accident of fate, go I, or was it, this is screwed, let's just back up Salman?
I think people just thought, this is really serious, don't fuck it up. I think it just was one of those moments where everybody thought, okay, this is it really matters, and concentrate, focus, don't get it wrong. And it was a collective act of solidarity. It even got to the point where the police, who initially were very suspicious of all these left-wing, artistic,
writerly types.
I mean, this is the British secret police, you know what I mean? They're not liberal Democrats. And they came to really respect my friends and to realize that those people had actually were helping them a lot. And one of the oddest things to have come out of this whole thing is some of these friendships have continued, you know, between members of Literary London and the British Secret Police, which is something that none of us thought would happen. But for instance, like now, just less than 2 weeks ago, we had a launch event for this book in London, and I invited quite a lot of the cops that I'd got to know in those years, and quite a few of them came. And there they were amongst, you know, the literati, saying, "Hi, how are you? How are you?" And by the way, some of them very good looking.
And strong, don't forget strong.
And really fit, and, you know, packing heat.
That's pretty irresistible.
They were like very sexy, and it used to be, there were moments when, you know, when I would be able to sort of walk into a room, when I noticed, may I say, particularly female members of Literary London, sort of looking over my shoulder to see where the protection officers were. You know, oh, hi, Bob. Hi. And Salman's over there. You know, so that happened.
That's funny. Were you surprised at some of the people who didn't step forward to become part of that ring? Some of the people who you thought were probably better friends than they turned out to be, or who just weren't brave enough?
Nobody who was a real friend disappointed me at all. There were people who I knew that I thought I was on friendly terms with, you know, who, and I mean, truthfully, I don't want to overstate this, because in general, the literary world showed remarkable solidarity, and it was very important. And I think one of the reasons why I can name a few names is that there were so few people who broke ranks that I remember all their names. And yeah, there were one or two. I mean, there was, in England, there's, you know, John le Carré and I had a famous
falling out, as they say here.
Falling out, yeah. Where, you know, he had, and I mean, in a way, I'm sorry it happened, because in fact, I admire him, you know, and I think he's a wonderful writer. And I think there's at least 2 or 3 of his books that are very extraordinary, not just as spy novels, but, you know, as metaphors of England. I think Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy is an extraordinary, almost like an allegory of the decline of post-war England, you know, and I mean, I think he's something very like a great writer, you know, and I, on the whole, wouldn't wish to be at odds with him, you know, but anyway, we were. And the one thing now, I mean, I think in many ways, I think both of us slightly regret it. And then Hitchens jumped into the middle of it, made it much ruder. It got much worse.
A lot of these letters are reprinted.
They were on the front page of the fucking newspaper.
They were.
The newspapers were so excited.
So it's the most erudite form of fisticuffs you'll ever see, but I mean, literally, they were kind of calling each other out in the streets and just da. And then sooner or later, friends on either side jumped in, and it got bigger and more amazing until eventually it's like, oh, come on, life is too short.
Both of us probably wish it hadn't happened.
As a reader, I'm glad it happened, because it was really interesting.
I know it was fun for everybody else, but
and it's all about us.
There's one, I mean, as I say, in a way, you know, I'm happy to wipe it all away. There's one thing that he said that I think is important to take issue with, because one of his arguments was that, let me try and remember exactly what he said. He said, if you take on a known enemy, then you can't complain if that enemy behaves as you know that it would. You know, there's no point crying for help afterwards, because you knew who that person was when you went up after them.
It's like that old joke that says you knew it was a snake before you picked it up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the trouble with that argument, which seems kind of plausible on the surface, is that it ignores one of the most magnificent things about the history of literature, which is that writers have always done that. Writers have always gone up against tyrants, you know, without armies. You know, Osip Mandelstam knew what Stalin was like. It didn't stop him writing a poem about Stalin, which ended up getting him sent to labor camp where he died. You know, Lorca knew what Franco was like. You know, I mean, writers have always had the courage to take on known enemies, because they're known enemies. One of the things that literature has the most wonderful record of is confronting tyranny. And it's one of the reasons why when people try to be tyrants, the first thing they try to do is to lock up the writers. So for Le Carré to suggest that that's what you shouldn't do, ignores the fact that that's one of the most distinguished things about the history of literature. And I thought that needed to be taken up.
This was a hardship for your, at that point, only son, who was
Yeah.
old enough to know some of what was going on.
Yes.
How did you manage to parent at arm's length?
And he was 9.5 when this happened. It really went on more one way or another until he was 21. So he had to grow up through this bizarre time. And to make it worse, the parent who was supposed to be safe, who was looking after him, his mother, died during those years. And she got breast cancer and died. So he had to deal with that too, I think, there he is, now he's 33, and you would not be surprised if he'd ended up being a basket case of some kind. But instead, he's this incredibly serene, grounded, centered, calm person, much calmer than me, I'm a waver of arms, He's like nothing flaps him, and he's unflappable.
I can imagine a bad day at the office just wouldn't faze him at all, considering.
No, you can't really. What can you throw at him, that he hasn't already had to deal with? But it speaks very highly of his strength of character that he came through this as he has. All I could do was, I discovered very early on, like right at the beginning when the news was roaring, and every day there was these dreadful images on television of people demanding his father's death, and, people marching down the streets of foreign cities, etc. Very difficult stuff for a 9-year-old boy to see. And I understood very quickly that I needed to talk to him quite openly about it. And obviously try and put the most positive spin I could on this, Try and say, yes, it's terrible, but it's going to be okay. But I found that as long as he was hearing it from me first, so he felt he had the kind of inside track on the info, he was able to handle it. The one or two times that I wasn't able to get to him and tell him about something, and he heard it like, in the school playground, somebody came up to him and say, hey, guess what they're doing about your dad today? Then he would freak out. And so it became clear to me that I had to really start treating him in a very grown-up way. I had to sort of bring him inside and say, look, this so-and-so today said this, and so-and-so said that, and then, here are some bullshit reasons why it doesn't matter. But I thought that process of involving him in it, I think, was helpful to him.
You've often said that since all this happened and has calmed down, America has given you your life back. What do you mean by that?
This whole thing went on, more or less for about 12 years. And in the last four, 5 of those years, it began to be possible. The American authorities said that they'd be willing for me to just come to America and just live my own life, etc. And what it did was it gave me back a measure of control over my life. That instead, whereas in England I was stuck inside the security bubble, which was very claustrophobic. Even though we got on fine and all that, but still it was claustrophobic. And the U.S. said that if I wanted to just come and stay and just take my chances, make my own decisions, etc., that was okay with them. And so it started off that I would come for, short, like a week or 10 days, and gradually it got longer until I was able to come for, 2, even almost 3 months a year, and just, get a place in either in the city or in upstate New York or Long Island or somewhere, and just live, and it was exhilarating to get out of the bubble, and to be able to, drive my own car. Have the key to my front door in my pocket, and not have 4 men with guns following me around everywhere. And so I've always felt that it was America which began the process by which I was able to reclaim my free life, you know. And I think there's no question that then, when the thing got politically sorted out, then I wanted to live in America, you know, because that's where it had happened. And so I ended up settling in New York, and I think it's directly related to the fact that that's where I was able to begin that act of reclamation.
Do you feel like you can live your own private life? You don't feel intruded upon?
This word celebrity has been so debased in our time that you know, now I think it means Lindsay Lohan and Kim Kardashian, etc. It doesn't mean people who've actually done something to be famous for. If you're a writer, it doesn't impinge that much, you know. And yes, I get recognized a bit, and
Do people say, hey, you're that guy?
no, they don't. They say, hello, Mr. Rushdie. The rudest thing anybody ever said was there was this sort of Indian-looking guy in New York who came up to me and said, I just want to say to you that V.S. Naipaul is 10 times better writer than you.
That's funny. That is great.
To which you replied,
I said, well, you must feel a lot better now that you've said it, you know. and he said, yes, I just wanted you to know that. You know? And then,
that's as rude as it gets. You're golden. Over here.
On September the 10th, you were in an American city giving a talk. Tell us what happened subsequent to that day.
every day.
No, just a few days afterwards, because I would have always wanted to ask you what happened, because they stopped all the planes.
Because what?
They stopped all the planes.
Yeah, well, I got stuck in Texas for a little couple of days. I mean, no, it was, you know, the strange thing about, that was the book tour for my novel Fury, which was a novel about New York called Fury, that was published on September 11, 2001. I mean, just the most ridiculous coincidence. But as it happened, I'd begun the book tour a few days early, so I'd done a couple of events in New York at September 6, 7, like that, and then I was in Boston, and I have to say, flew out of Boston on a wide-bodied jet at 8:30 in the morning on September the 9th.
Wow.
You know? And it's one of those moments when you think, when it's not your time, it's not your time. You know, and it was in retrospect, terrifying. It was 48 hours earlier. Same time, same airport. And then I was in Houston, doing a reading from the book, and the next morning I was supposed to go on the next leg of the book tour, which I think was to Minneapolis. And I remember I was in my hotel room packing up. I've never formed this American habit of waking up and turning on the TV. You know, I don't do that. Right? So the TV was not on. And I was supposed to be doing a radio interview with some journalist, and he called me in my hotel room early, and he said, you know, because of what's happened in New York, we're having to cancel the interview because we have to dump into the coverage from coming out of New York City. And I said, what happened in New York? And there was this silence, and he said, turn on the damn television. Wow. And so I turned on the television, and like 6 seconds later, saw the second plane. Like all of us, I was standing there, stunned, and not knowing what to do. I mean, who knew what to do? You know, this was actually before the ground stop was announced. I thought, should I go to the airport? I mean, have I got to go on the next leg of the book tour? I mean, what do we do here? In the end, the driver was there, and calling my room saying, you know, I'm here, sir. You know, so I thought, okay, let's go to the airport. You know, so I got my bags and set off for the airport, and as we were sort of halfway to the airport, it came on the radio saying, don't go to the airport, you know, because everything stopped. And so I ended up having to go back to Houston, and the people who had organized the reading that I'd done the previous night were very helpful, and there was another writer, friend of ours, who was for similar reasons stuck in Washington, D.C. He couldn't fly back to Houston. And so he lent me his house. So I ended up, he said, you know, you can have my house as long as you feed my dog. so I went to his house and fed his dog, you know, and actually, it was nice to have a writer's house at that crazy moment. It was nice to be in a literary environment with books and so on. And this, of course, like everyone, television on non-stop with these terrible images, more or less on loop. And yeah, I was stuck there for about 2 days and until the plane started flying again. So yes, I got to know Houston, Texas, better than I ever thought I would.
You hinted at the rich literary tradition of protest against fascism. Does there exist today in modern Muslim world any protest literature or anything that would
Yeah,
be
I
similar?
mean, good question. I mean, I think the answer is, I wish there was. But I think the problem is that everything is so shut down that it's very difficult for that to happen. I mean, there isn't even any real evidence of a kind of samizdat literature, you know, kind of underground literature. What there is the fact that a lot of the leading writers of the Arab world have been forced into exile and are living in other countries. You know, Tahir Ben-Jaloun lives in Paris, and you know, Asiya Jabbar lives in the United States, and I mean, so on. There's a lot of writers who've been obliged to scatter, and they speak out. Yes, they do, and because they're in a, to put it simply, they're sort of in a position of safety. But from inside the Muslim world, it's very hard. I mean, even if you look at the cinema, you know, the Iranian cinema is going through this kind of moment where it's very highly regarded, you know, internationally. But the filmmakers have to skirt around politics. And find a kind of fable-like, allegorical, very indirect way of talking about what's happening in the country to make it look as if they're not talking about what's happening in the country. It's very tough. I mean, it really is. There isn't much, no.
I'd like you to talk a little bit. I'm sure that in those 9 years, and since familiar with your writing, you've had plenty of time to ponder the nature of evil and fundamentalism. I was wondering if you could speak to that, not so much with regard to what's going on in the Muslim world, but what's even more timely right now is the fundamentalism in this country and the divides. I heard the Indian guru Sri Ravi Krishna say a while ago that he thought evil was really just ignorance and kind of unenlightened self-interest. And at the time I thought that was too simple, but the more I've thought about it, I think there may be something to that. So if you could comment on your experience and thoughts about that, I'd appreciate it.
All right, that's a big question. Well, let me just say something about it. I think, first of all, one of the things that's very disappointing to somebody of my age, which is basically a child of the 60s, you know, I mean, I was 21 in 1968, and you don't get to be more of a child of the 60s than that, is we never really thought that there was ever going to be a moment again when religion was going to move to the center of the stage. You know, that seemed to be over. You know? I mean, the arguments in the 60s had to do with, you know, with civil rights and feminism and Vietnam War, and then there was, of course, the other side. There was sex and drugs and rock and roll, you know. And the thing there wasn't was religion. It wasn't really a subject. And we all believed that that argument was over. And suddenly, we all discovered we were wrong, and that you're right. It's not just an Islamic issue. It seems to be an issue everywhere now. This country, the rise of the Christian right is a very worrying thing. And I mean, even in my country of origin, in India, where nobody ever thought, I mean, the term militant Hinduism, it would seem like a contradiction in terms, you know, for a long time. But now, that's what there is. You know, there is a kind of very kind of neo-fascist Hindu movement with, you know, with gangs of bully boys and so on, and it's become very worrying, and that there are a lot of attacks on minorities and indeed on the arts in India in a way that's very depressing. And here too, I mean, I think one of the things that's most different on the political scene for somebody who's used to living in England and Europe is how much religion moves to the center of the political scene here. That, you know, I don't think you can get elected dog catcher in America unless you go to church or synagogue or something, you know. The atheist dog catcher is rare in America. And I've always found that very worrying. You know, the way in which the rhetoric of religion can be marshaled to attack a whole range of things, like, for example, you know, women's right to choose, sexual minorities, and all that whole range of things that we know about. And one has to hope that this is a phase that the world will get over, because it's depressing to see this, because after all, this country's constitution was founded on the ideas of the French Enlightenment, as imported by Tom Paine, basically. And the French Enlightenment, the great writers of that movement, understood that their real battle was not against the state, it was against the church. The church at that time still had available, anathemas, excommunication, inquisitions, a whole range of weapons with which to try and limit thought of a certain kind. And there's no question that people like Diderot, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Voltaire knew that if they were going to win a battle for free expression, they had to win it against the church, not against the state. And they did. And we are the inheritors of that. The American idea of free expression derives directly from that battle. And now we find ourselves having, as I say, we thought this battle was won. That you don't have to fight this war again. And now it turns out that you do. But it's as important to fight it now as it was 200 years ago. And we don't want to let that victory be lost now because we don't have the balls to fight it.